Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropotamus, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest episode of Anthropotamus. Today we're here with Susan Terrio. We're going to be discussing her new book, Forced Out, Migrant Mothers in Search of Refuge and Hope. Thank you so much, Susan, for being on the show with us today.
My pleasure.
So before we get into the book, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your professional and academic background.
Sure. So I have a somewhat unusual professional background. When I decided to go for my doctorate, I chose New York University because they have a dual PhD program, which is very unusual. So it's a program that provides grounding in a social science, in my case, anthropology, as well as regional studies. So it allowed me to really get a very extensive background, both in the social science and in the area of study that I wanted initially to concentrate on. And interestingly, I've spent my entire career at Georgetown University. I was hired before I even defended my dissertation. That's a funny story, but I won't go into it now, except that I was fortunate enough to get that position, to be tenured, to work my way up through the academic hierarchy and finish as a full professor in 2018. So I loved Georgetown because of all of the research possibilities and the support that we had, and that allowed me to move in many different directions, starting with my first book, which centered on artisanal chocolate production in France. Then I went on to juvenile delinquency in the Paris Juvenile Court. And that's interesting. And that's a segue into how I got to research, got interested in the topic of this book. I was spending time observing judicial proceedings in the Paris Juvenile Court and seeing a population I initially did not expect to see. And they were separated and unaccompanied kids who were coming from both Eastern Europe, largely Romanian children, and also North Africa and West Africa. And they thought if they got to Paris, they could either work or get into the educational system, and that was not a possibility. So from my vantage point of attending judicial proceedings, I saw in a very short period of time a court that prided itself on being rehabilitative in its approach went on to become much more punitive. So, and the end result was that these kids were very vulnerable and at risk, who had no other means of survival, were, shoplifting, they were engaging in theft, they were prostituting themselves, and they were ending up in court and being given sometimes short, but prison sentences or suspended prison sentences. So when I finished that project and published that book on juvenile delinquency in 2009, I wondered, how does it work in this country? So I went on to look at a federal custodial system that was put in place in this country to take care of kids who were leaving extremely vulnerable situations in the global South, primarily in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, as well as Mexico. They were traveling alone or with other kids and getting across the border. And at that point, we're talking about 2008 on. If they were alone without an adult, a guardian or a parent, and did not have legal status, they were immediately diverted into a detention system that was run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So I spent years between 2008 and 2014. I got permission to get inside those closed detention facilities and to see how the kids were treated when they were on the inside. And at the same time, because after apprehension, they were immediately put into immigration removal proceedings in the immigration court. And the problem with that from a social justice point of view is there's no guaranteed funded legal representation for anyone in immigration court. And it's particularly alarming for kids who are under 18 and end up in court in front of an immigration judge and someone representing the government and have no legal representation. So I observed those proceedings, got inside the facilities, but at the same time, found those kids after they were released, and that's where I interviewed them. And their stories were really inspiring, but also very depressing in another way. So that book, Whose Child Am I, came out in 2015. And 4 years later, I continued to work on that population, kids who were detained and in many cases deported from the United States back to situations of vulnerability. I published a co-edited volume called Illegal Encounters, and that had a larger sort of lens, if you will. In addition to anthropologists, we had sociologists, we had activists, we had immigration judges and attorneys who were all gave their perspective on a system that everyone viewed as compromised. So finally segueing into the book Forced Out. So I continued to be very interested in the situations of undocumented families, both parents and children. And I'll remember attending a conference, an immigration conference in 2017 at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington. And I attended a session that was given by two immigration attorneys. They were attempting to represent mothers and children who had crossed the border, and this was a relatively new phenomenon, and were detained in one of 3 private immigration prisons that had been created in 2014, expanded in 2014 by the Obama administration. One of the stories was really haunting. Bridget Cambria, who was an immigration attorney in Philadelphia, described an immigrant mother who was detained in a Berks County detention facility in Pennsylvania, and her young daughter had spit up blood for days before the authorities would agree to send her to an emergency room for care. So what they were doing, they were pleading for volunteers to travel to South Texas and to volunteer as legal assistants in 2 of the very large private immigration prisons, excuse me, in Dilley, Texas, and in Karnes City. So I did that in 2017 and 2018 after classes ended. This was before I retired. And it was one thing to read about the appalling conditions in these immigration prisons where the food is really rotten, the water is barely potable, the guards are abusive, sometimes just verbally, but many times physically, and where the use of solitary confinement is fairly routine, even for people who just complain. But then it's quite another to sit across the table from a mother who's attempting to explain why she had to flee her country with a young child because she faced imminent death from a gang member or had endured horrific domestic violence. So what struck me about in addition to having it be very, very difficult, was how invisible the mothers were and how we knew at that point, that was in 2017, 2018, we knew a lot about the kids who were coming across the border and getting stuck in detention, but we knew much less about the mothers, what was happening to them in these prisons, how difficult it was to get out, and what challenges they faced when they were finally released. So they were invisible. They experienced a loss of agency. They were not able to tell their stories in their own voices and in their own way. So, those were ordeals that were not public at that time. So it was at that point that I thought, I've got to concentrate on the mothers. I have to do some research. So I was still in the greater Washington, D.C. area at that point, and heard about a really innovative program in Northern Virginia in the Fairfax County Public Schools. This is a program that existed primarily for refugee and immigrant families who had come to the area. And that was in Northern Virginia, that was one of the fastest growing destinations for immigrants during that period of time. So this program allowed the mothers to help get their children enrolled in school, to access the services that were available to them, but more important, gave them classes. They were called family reunification or parent project classes, because the parents having just arrived, and in many cases having had to leave their their children behind and come ahead to get settled in this country. They didn't know anything about, American society. They didn't speak the language. They didn't understand the rules about school, the regulations, what a parent-teacher conference is, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a wonderful program, and I made contact with the people who ran that program. And one of the young women, Ligia Diaz, was an administrator in that program, and she was a researcher and is a researcher in her own right. So I asked her if she could connect me with some of the mothers who had arrived fairly recently in Northern Virginia. And so that was the beginning of a collaboration that extended that entire year. And just to set the context, it was a very challenging period to try and talk to people who did not have legal documentation and who were under the threat of an intensive immigration enforcement regime that had been introduced after the Trump administration came to power. So Ligia was, it was absolutely essential for her to introduce me to the mothers and to persuade them that I could be trusted. She vouched for me. And because of this intensified immigration enforcement, there were workplace raids, there were ICE vehicles that were stationed outside of public schools, outside of places where immigrant workers went to hopefully get a job for a day, outside of churches, Hispanic churches. So it was a really difficult period to try and talk to people who did not have legal status. So with her help, I identified and interviewed a number of these migrant mothers, and we went into their homes, and I was amazed at how willing they were to share their stories, to open up, including really intimate details, and not only their stories. They encouraged me in many cases to talk to the children from whom they had been separated, in many cases for years, had successfully been reunified with, and they encouraged me to talk to their kids and hear their experiences from the kids' point of view. So it was a real challenge getting these women to talk to me. And I worried, what kind of risks were they incurring? Would they be re-traumatized by telling me these, in many cases, horrific stories? And the other issue was that they're part of a shadow labor force. They were undocumented, and to make ends meet, they often had to work 2 or 3 jobs. They had to parent their kids. They had to take care of household duties, etc. So it was challenging, to say the least. And I'll continue. So, and as I said, I made contact with the woman who was managing this immigration integration project in the Fairfax schools. And one of the most illuminating things I was able to do that year was attend the classes that had been created for the mothers. They were free for the mothers to attend. They had childcare available for their kids. And they were taught by immigrant instructors. These were all women who had lived in the United States for years. They came from mostly Mexico or Central America, and they had legal status, but their experiences informed the way they were able to teach these classes and provide really helpful advice. So it was the exchanges between the mothers in those classes, in addition to the interviews that I did inside their homes, that really gave me incredible insight into the challenges that they had experienced.
The book is story after story of all these women's struggles. And it's, to say the least, it's sad. There's sad story after sad story. And I think in the back of our heads, we know like these women are struggling. They come from poverty, but as Americans, I don't think we realize how bad some women have it and how much they really go through to get here, just hoping to survive and have better lives. But out of all the women you interviewed, all the families you interviewed, is there any one particular moment that really you think stuck with you or influenced you?
That's a great question. There are a number, and I'll mention two. I begin and end the book with a woman I call Teresa, her story, because her story encapsulates the worst ordeals of what anyone could endure, starting with a rape by a school principal who was 26 years older than she was, having to leave a child behind because after she gained independence from him, he stalked her and threatened her. She left that child behind and had an incredibly traumatic experience. She nearly died twice on the journey, got across the border, ultimately was rescued by Customs and Border Protection, then spent time in an immigration prison. You know, the first thing that happened to her when she got there was she ran to hug someone she knew from home, being astounded that she knew someone in the prison, and then she was sent to solitary confinement because it was against the rules to hug someone. But I mean, what was so astounding was after getting her daughter across the border in 1 year, that was highly exceptional because of the costs, the smuggling costs, because of the costs of living in the United States. It was very unusual to get a child across this highly militarized border in such a short period of time. Then she finds a man she thinks is just a wonderful person. He's active in their church. And it turns out when she's working the night shift, he's sexually abusing her daughter. So that, and then what she had to go through, and again, this is a testament to the Fairfax County Public Schools, that they have these parent liaison personnel in the schools who interact, speak Spanish or speak the native language, interact with the kids. And because she learned what sex abuse was, she was able to report that to the liaison officer in the school, who was a wonderful woman, but that involved Child Protective Services. It involved an enormous, lengthy legal procedure, and reintroduced extreme economic hardship for the family. So the point is, ultimately, she was able to get a U visa, which is a form of protection for people who have been the victims of serious crime and who collaborate with American law enforcement to bring that person to justice. But it was such an improbable set of horrific circumstances. And the fact that she was the only mother in the entire book who ended up with some form of legal status. And when I met and interviewed her, she had gotten the U visa, but there's still a waiting period before she could petition for US citizenship. So that's a story. And, you know, as you said, these are stories about struggle, but I also want readers to take a step back and consider how resilient and resourceful these women are. Imagine being confronted with a set of circumstances like that, nearly dying twice, having to deal with a repressive regime, this migration crisis in El Salvador, where there is active collusion between public officials and criminal groups, where homicides are roughly the same as war zones. Crime itself is rarely prosecuted, investigated, or solved. So experiencing all of these ordeals, I think it's really inspiring that someone like that, first of all, could get across the border, could work those jobs and make sure her daughter got safely to the United States, and then end up in a better place. And the other story that still haunts me is the story of the woman called. It's the child who asks this question: who is this woman? She was a US citizen. She was born in this country. Her mother sent her back to be raised by a grandmother. And then her mother, figuring that she would have the legal advantage of being a US citizen, insisted that she come back to the United States. Her elder daughter came first, and then found herself in American school, where even the people who spoke Spanish, the kids who spoke Spanish, wanted nothing to do with her because she was a new migrant. She didn't know her mother. She was incredibly unhappy. She wanted to return to El Salvador. That's a script that we don't expect to see. We expect to see that she would adapt. She had access to this wonderful program in the Fairfax County schools. And why wasn't she happy? Why didn't she take advantage of it? But that's the flip side aside to, a family reunification after years of separation. She really didn't know her mother. That, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around. And I don't know what happened to her. I know that her mother, having endured a number of serious ordeals in her life, was convinced that she was not allowed, give in to her daughter's wish to go back to El Salvador. So those are two stories that, have stayed with me because, they point out, the ongoing, it's not just the immediate trauma of getting across the border and, finding some sort of security, but it's the long-term challenges of adapting to a place where you didn't grow up, where even if you speak the language, learn to speak the language, there will continually be things that you don't understand, and don't accept, and where family is not something that you can count on in the way you had anticipated.
So you mentioned how she wanted to go back, and then I believe in the book there was also someone whose son wanted to go back. He was living on a farm. He was struggling with fighting at school. So is this fairly common for children wanting to go back?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I could answer that definitively. I think on some level, kids who were separated from their mothers or parents, and I'm talking about mothers because mostly the mothers were the ones who did the parenting and reunified with the kids. I think that's a fairly normal reaction. And it requires, and again, I quote, I mentioned the Fairfax County School program because it provided an avenue for the parents, mostly mothers, and their children to express their disappointment, to express their frustration, and to work it out in a sort of structured environment with tons of support from not only principals, but social workers, from guidance counselors, and from these Spanish speaking staff. So that kind of support takes a lot of money. It takes, a lot of commitment on the part of the schools. And unfortunately, I think the kids who end up maybe in the Midwest or in other parts of the country probably won't have access to those kinds of systems of support. But I think it's completely understandable for kids who've grown up in a different place. And, one of the things that many of the kids mentioned was they didn't have the same freedom, and it wasn't the same model of sociality. Kids would go home from school if they're not in sports and, stay in their homes or have play dates or have people come to their homes. That was not the model that they grew up with in their home countries. So there was a whole process of adjustment, not only from food, but to all of these ways in which people interact with one another and with their parents. I think again, this was a small sample, and that's what we do as anthropologists. We don't have, we don't have large survey instruments. We try and get inside people's experiences, try and understand their worldview and the challenges they've had. But I think that's a completely normal process, and with the appropriate support, I think that there can be good outcomes. But as one of the other kids who wrote that letter to President Trump, if they feel that they are the object of scorn, derision, and they see themselves depicted as predators, as rapists, as criminals, that has a terrible effect on them, even when they have supportive teachers who are trying to, explain that this is, a very fraught political climate. Those kinds of things really take a toll. And I think the lesson is for, us to, to provide the supports they need and to educate people and to get the right kind of information out to the general public, if at all possible.
So, yeah, so I actually went to school with a number of people who immigrated here. I'm going to use air quotes illegally. One of my best friends in high school was actually an immigrant from El Salvador, where I believe he actually grew up he was born and grew up here in the United States, but his mother and his two older brothers immigrated here from El Salvador. I was wondering if you had a chance to speak with those young people who grew up here in the same family as people who immigrated, and if you saw any differences in the way they spoke or view the world.
You mean if they grew up in this country,
Yeah,
largely
versus
from mixed
those
status
people.
families?
Yeah, so those people who those children who grew up in the United States versus the kids who did not grow up in the United States and immigrated here in the same household.
No, that's a great question. And personally, that was not the focus of my research. But in the book that I mentioned, Illegal Encounters, that was the co-edited volume, there were a number of chapters that focused on families like that, mixed status families, and kids who had grown, spent most of their lives here because, they came as young children. I mean, if they didn't have legal status, and again, I'm thinking of the students I had at Georgetown. Georgetown had a very enlightened process about supporting kids who didn't have legal status and were thus ineligible for federal student loans, but they provided them the ability to attend Georgetown without incurring huge debts. Those kids were in a better place in some sense because they had support, but they also, again, because of the risks that they took if they didn't have legal status, even if they spent most of their lives in this country. And I'm thinking about one young woman, she ended up being the valedictorian of her class in 2015. She came from Monterrey in Mexico, and she had spent all of her life in this country, but her parents had never told her that she didn't have legal status. She came here when she was really young. So she didn't find out until she was in high school and wanted to apply for a driver's license. And her parents kept putting her off. That's just one example. So they thought it was a form of protection. But in fact, she was incredibly disillusioned. And there were those frustrations. That same group, this was before DACA, this was before the Deferred Action for Child Arrivals, which did provide a form of protection, not legal status. And a number of those kids were at Georgetown, and I had them in class. So on the one hand, they felt, they were supported very generously, but on the other hand, when it came time for graduation, their parents were afraid to travel to Washington, D.C., wherever they were living, whether it was in Texas or New York, because of the risks of being picked up and detained and deported. So I think even if you've lived in this country, you speak, for all intents and purposes, you are an American socially and culturally. If you don't have legal status, and if you're in a mixed status family where some of your siblings are US citizens and you're not, that sets up a situation, not always, but potentially frustration and resentment.
Not a question, but a comment. While reading the book, I once had a friend whose mother was from El Salvador, and I would ask him about his dad because his dad was never around.
Yeah,
And I would ask, I was like, "Who's your dad?" or "Where's your dad?" I was like, "Why don't you ever speak about your dad?" And I would never get an answer. It would just
no,
be silence. But I was after I started reading the book, I was like, "Oh, maybe that's why he never spoke about his dad. That explains that." Whether or not
right.
that was the case, but you got me thinking. I was like, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't have been asking about his dad then."
Well, and who knows? I mean, the dads, could have been working, 2 and 3 jobs. They could have already been detained or deported. There are a myriad reasons why. I mean, and again, I don't want to give the impression that all of these families are only headed by single mothers. But in the samples that I saw in the interviews that I did, that was the pattern. And it has so much to do with, our broken immigration system, our militarized southern border. That, I mean, there is an example in this book of a family that, she starts out by saying, we spent most of our marriage living apart, together for a few years in this country. He was deported, then one kid went back, and then that kid came back across the border. That's in the section called Border Trouble. That is, a new sort of definition of a transnational family, not by choice, but by the circumstances that we impose on these immigrant families. And it's really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask about something similar there. I know that fathers in general weren't the focus of this book,
Right.
but given the pattern that we see in the book, um, why do you think that we see so many families that are primarily, or so many situations where you'll have the fathers who they start off paying, sending money back, and then suddenly they disappear and drop off the face of the earth. Uh,
Right.
I'm wondering if you think, obviously, with the militarized border, I'm wondering if there isn't more of a target on their back, if you will, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's the effective distance of economic marginality, legal vulnerability. But, and there is, with I, the risk of overgeneralizing, there is a real pattern in Central America with cultural expectations about parenthood and responsibility. And I think, particularly for the women, and again, remember, they came largely between 2000, 2005, a few between 2006 and 2013. But the expectation was that the mothers were the ones who had the responsibility, both financial, social, for parenting. And as you can see in these stories, and I think that's a pattern, they had often had multiple partners because there was this sense that, men, for whatever reasons, if they had to go elsewhere to find work, they started other families, they were supporting those families. I think that the onus and responsibility and joy of raising kids largely fell to women. And if all things were equal, and if everyone had an equal shot at, a sort of a normal life and didn't face the consequences of a social death, which is in effect not being able to provide for your family, not being able to have decent housing, not having access to healthcare, maybe the familial, excuse me, patterns would be different, but such as it is, I think, and again, I don't want to say that there aren't any really loving and committed fathers, but I think the pattern, because of, economic circumstances, and the forces that push people into migration, it's a pattern that makes it difficult for families to stay together and maintain relationships.
Do you think that mortality rates between men and women might have anything to do with that?
They could very well. And, again, I haven't looked into that. But yeah, they absolutely could. And just, look, I was just rereading an article about what's happening in El Salvador now under the populist dictatorship of Nayib Bukele. One of the things he did, I mean, there was an outrageously high homicide rate of like 106 deaths per 100,000. The world average is like 6 per 100,000. And he brought that down to 7.8 by basically incarcerating 100,000 young men, and sticking them in prisons. If you have a chance, you should look at some of the YouTube videos of those young men, full of tattoos, yes, but because he declared a state of emergency and instituted a policy of mass incarceration. When in and that's happening in Honduras and in many other places, Ecuador, Colombia. If there had been some other emphasis, primarily on education systems that were appropriately funded, work opportunities, to make sure that these kids didn't look to gangs for their survival and a form of family that they didn't have. So I think, the toll on young men in particular has been really, really difficult.
I thought it was funny. I don't say like funny, haha, but like interesting how you have these men going into these gangs and then threatening people for money. And I'm like, you are all poor. Like the whole reason you got in the game because you were poor and they're poor and they're in the same situation you are. Like, what money do you think you're going to get from them? Like, I don't understand. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? There's nothing to take. There's nothing.
Well,
Well, I
I'm
I
sorry,
was
go
gonna
ahead.
I apologize.
No,
I was
no.
gonna say that I do think it's that particular situation it's more of a survival response, right? Because you have,
Totally,
let's
totally.
say you're in a situation where you don't have access to modern amenities, we don't have grocery stores, nothing like that. You're not going to be very picky on what you take and what you eat,
That's
right?
right.
So if you're in a situation, and obviously, down in those countries, it's a whole lot more difficult. You have these gangs that are taking, and being one of them means that you get some of that take. So
Exactly.
no matter how small amount that is, it's still better than getting taken from.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a self-reinforcing cycle. It reproduces itself because there are in effect no other opportunities, because public institutions are so weak. The rule of law is so weak, and there are so few possibilities for, a life that would include, as I said before, opportunity and a viable means to support yourself. Yeah, if a gang is the only way that you can get food and get a sense of people, who stick with you and have a sense of loyalty and, solidarity from a point of view that we would see as, absolutely perverted, of course you're going to go with that. So, yeah.
So with elections coming up, how do you see a change in
Oh,
immigration policy? I don't know. I think last article I said that Trump was more likely to win than Biden, but I don't.
oh my
I'm kind of
God.
at this point. I'm kind of hoping they just both lose and we all can just give up on the two of
Can,
them.
can we just get somebody who's a little more in touch
Oh
I
in
God,
know.
all of it?
I
it's so
know.
bad.
It's
Oh.
it's really bad. But the thing that, well, I've been very disillusioned with the Biden administration, because of, and actually in November, I did a lecture on the challenges of seeking asylum in this country. And initially there were positive signs because his Attorney General, Merrick Garland, reversed some of the restrictions that had been placed on the possibilities for asylum, from persecution by gangs and domestic violence. So that was a good thing. And they made it possible for particularly unaccompanied minors to get the kind of treatment that they deserved. But, for the past couple of years, he's imposed, really, really unfortunate limitations on the possibility for asylum. And but the thing that is so distressing is, the distorted messages, the moral panics that have been created by the former president. And people, I mean, it's such a contradiction because Americans in general, when they look at the polls, they are positively disposed toward immigration if there are certain guardrails, if there are certain requirements that are met. But the media images of people swarming the border, of, sort of living under, highway overpasses, of, endless need, I think, in addition to the messages about their being criminal, about their being all being illiterate and indigent, I think that really takes a toll. And, frankly, given what we've experienced, coming out in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, that immigration should be one of the number one issues. Obviously, the economic situation is really important, but are somewhat surprising until you see the manipulation of social media and the messages that continue to bombard Americans. I'll just give you one example. I gave a very nonpartisan lecture on the challenges of seeking asylum, the way the rules have changed, the difference between refugees and asylees, et cetera, et cetera. And I was not arguing for open borders. I was just pointing out that if you really had a credible fear of persecution under, current immigration law, how difficult it was, first of all, to get legal representation, et cetera. And there were a record number of people who showed up for that. It was the Savannah Council on World Affairs, which is not a left or right. It's a nonpartisan organization. So, there was standing room only, and I thought, oh, and there seemed to be a receptive, a receptive response, and I think some people felt felt that they had been educated about something they knew nothing about. But one of my friends talked to a man who went to that lecture and said, well, now I know why I've got to vote for you know who, because she was advocating for us opening the borders and letting everyone in. And that is not at all what I said, but it seemed to me an excellent example of the way in which people hear what they're already predisposed to hear based on a prejudice that they've developed with regard to a particular group of people. So I don't have high hopes, and I'm dreading the presidential debates because it will just end up being a shouting match, and the lowest common denominator in terms of who's going to be the most harsh on people who really deserve protection and will not get it because the immigration courts are understaffed, under-resourced. The backlogs are enormous. And it was a system, just one additional comment about that was never designed to address mass migration, because each case has got to be evaluated on the individual merits. So it's understandable that the courts are overwhelmed with, asylum claims and other possibilities. And the issue is we have so few legal avenues for people to get residence in this country. Mostly it's family reunification. 66% of the people who end up here legally do so because they have family ties, and another 14% through their employers. Only 13% of the people who end up here legally are through humanitarian avenues. So it's a system that's broken and really, really needs to be fixed, but that's not going to happen. And the presidential debates and what we have in store for us is not particularly encouraging.
We had, or before I start, Les, do you have any comments or questions?
I was actually going to comment on something that you said there, and it kind of struck me. You were saying, and you're absolutely right. The image that comes to mind for a lot of people when they imagine immigrants as, well, living on the streets, or they don't speak English, or all these other different, things that we perceive as problems, right? And it can be difficult to communicate with people who don't speak English, but I'll tell you, and I'll say it right now, people that I've gone to school with, people that I've worked with, um, people who I've, gone and sat at tables with and ate dinner with, who were immigrants, who immigrated illegally, some of the hardest working people I've ever met.
Exactly.
Some of the hardest working people I've ever met. And not only that, but when you consider the kind of things that they've had to actually go through to get where they are, and the kind of restrictions that we have in place that really just limit their access to things like housing, to things like language learning or anything else like that, it's no wonder that a lot of these problems are in place. It's just, it strikes me as another one of those self-reinforcing problems, right? So if we're doing all of this to bar the access of people, right? And really what matters in the world more than, other humans, right? Whether it's our own families or other families, it's just the unity of those communities, right? If we're
Right.
doing everything that we can to restrict these people and make sure that they can't get a foothold here, how do we expect them to integrate into society?
Exactly. Well, I mean, and the other really pressing issue is we have a demographic crisis in this country. We need, on a sort of a crude level, we need their labor. We need to educate them. We need to integrate them. We need to provide them with opportunities, and we will all benefit. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people every day who are retiring. So, and coming from the Washington, D.C. area, we've only lived in Savannah now 6 years. I spent my career in D.C. That whole area runs on immigrant labor. Immigrants are the people who take care of our kids, paint our houses, mow our lawns, do all of the things that enable us to, have, good lives. So we need to do more to we need to create more avenues for legal status. And, you know, a very simple fix, it seems to me, I'm not a politician or a legislator, would be to create visas that allow these people to go back and forth. Very few of the people, the hundreds of people I've interviewed since I began thinking about this, very few of them made the conscious choice to settle in the United States. They were pushed out. And if they had the means to go back and forth, they would do so. And they would be a contributing force in both countries, in the US and in their home countries. So it's just such a convoluted and dysfunctional system that we have created, largely due to political pressures and political biases. And, you know, and I'm sure you see this in California too. A huge percentage of people have immigrant roots or are just, you know, maybe one generation away from having come here themselves. So there are so many things that need to change, and attitudes towards immigrants as not a negative, but a potentially very positive influence.
I just had a comment. We had so about a year ago, we had Dr. Corey Ragsdale on the show, and his episode was about, he had a conference, I think it was in Africa, about anthropologists and historians coming together to actually to review basically just human history and immigration and refugees, and to help. I don't remember which country it was, unless you remember what country it was. No, I don't.
I can't remember.
Anyways, it was basically they came together to help that country to decide on policy, what to do with all these refugees that were coming in.
Was it Yemen?
No, it was in Africa.
Oh, yeah, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Anyways, one of the biggest thing was, instead of in history, I guess immigrants tend to go towards large cities because they think that's where their work is, but in reality, they should be going to rural areas. And when I was, you know, reading the conclusion of the book, I was like, we should just send them all to rural areas and then go make them be doctors where all the doctors don't want to work. I was like, I was like, you want to stay here? You can become a nurse and go work in this rural region for 20 years that no one wants to work at. I mean, we have so many areas in the US where they just struggle to find nurses and psychologists and doctors. And I'm like, we'll just send them there. They will have like an ASVAB for immigrants.
Well, no, that's right. And, you know, anyone who works in any of those fields, you know, whether it's nursing, whether it's physician's assistant, whether it's social work, whether it's mental health, we realize and in this state, there are 159 counties in Georgia. We have one of the highest rates of maternal mortality and, you know, infant mortality. And there are many, many counties where there are no medical providers, zero, zip, certainly no gynecologists, no obstetricians. So if we, you know, really took a different perspective, provided education, provided language learning that is useful and productive, and then put people into programs, for the most part, I think there would be a hugely positive reception to that. And they're rural people. Mostly they come from rural areas. And I think I think that's a brilliant sort of solution to, you know, some of the acute shortages that we have in this country.
All right, so then we'll wrap this up. Thank you so much for being on the show. For our listeners, her book was titled Again, Forced Out. Please like and subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Castbox, iTunes, Audible. You can find us at www.anthropotamus.com or follow us at Twitter, Instagram at Anthropotamus. Thank you, and till next time, bye.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. And maybe I will be inspired to open an Instagram account.
Yes.
And if I do, should I send you that information? And that
yes, absolutely.
Okay. I will have my granddaughter, who is out in LA now as a music production engineer. I'll have her help me.
Great.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.